discussion for the third Wildlife Protection Government Law College National Online Moot Court Competition 2021. We have with us around 18 teams from all over the country who will be participating in the third Wildlife Protection National Moot Court Competition.
The Moot Court Association of Government Law College is hosting the third edition of the Wildlife Protection Government Law College National Online Moot Court Competition for a span of 2 days on 27th and 28th November 2021, starting from tomorrow morning. And the final rounds will be taking place on 28th of November at 5 p.m., which will be judged by Justice Dangre and Justice Ahuja. This competition is the first of its kind, dealing with complex issues such as wildlife conservation, sustainable development, environmental policy, rights of traditional forest dwellers, and constitutional law.
The topic for this year's panel discussion is compensation as a tool to mitigate human-wildlife conflict.
I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening's panel discussion, Ms. Shivangi Adani. Ms. Shivangi is an Innovation Associate, Environment at Dalberg Advisors, Asia. Prior to Dalberg, Shivangi has worked as an environment lawyer with Vanashakti Public Trust. She's a community member at the Initiative for Climate Action and is also closely associated with the Wildlife Conservation Trust. She has completed her training in law from Government Law College, Mumbai, and holds a graduate certificate in public policy from Takshashila Institution. Her focus areas within the environment sphere includes forest and water. I now request Ms. Shivangi to give a brief introduction and introduce our esteemed panelists.
Thanks a lot, Sakshi. Hello, everyone, and it is a pleasure to be here today and have this opportunity to kick off the competition as well as moderate the panel as a part of the third edition. This event started off when we identified that there is little to no focus on wildlife conservation and related environmental issues in law colleges in India. And ever since, our aim has been to bring some of these unique and challenging issues to light and equip as well as inspire young lawyers of today and tomorrow with not only knowledge and skills to deal with environmental issues, but also make them think scientifically about these issues. So with that in mind, every year our case study has a combination of legal questions as well as policy and scientific questions. So as Sakshi mentioned, this year the theme of the competition is compensation to mitigate human-wildlife conflict, whether compensation is adequate, how should it be calculated, and so on. And so we have with us today Ms. Akileshwari Reddy, Dr. Jitendra Ramgaonkar, and Dr. Anish Andheriya to talk to us about the various facets of human-wildlife conflict from their unique perspectives, the role of compensation, what are the problems with it, and of course, mitigation measures. I'm extremely excited to dive into the discussion with our panelists and hear from them. To introduce them briefly, Akileshwari is a senior resident fellow at the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, Karnataka. Her work focuses on the protection of human rights and the environment. She has worked on various projects, including those on disability rights, waste picker welfare, urban groundwater management, as well as human-wildlife conflict. She graduated from the West Bengal National University of Juridical Sciences, Kolkata, and went on to pursue her master's in human rights law at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She has also authored an important report discussing the need for a compensation law in the state of Karnataka. Moving on to Dr. Jitendra from the Indian. He's currently the field director of the Tadoba Andheri Tiger of Maharashtra. He pursued veterinary science from the Indian Veterinary Research Institute and Wildlife Management from WII Dehradun. He served briefly in Haryana till 2011, and since 2011 has served in the East Melghat Forest Division and Thane Forest Division. His work in the past decade has focused extensively on eco-development, community-based ecotourism, wildlife crime investigation, wildlife conflict mitigation, and wildlife management. Dr. Anish Andheriya is the president of the Wildlife Conservation Trust. He's a large carnivore biologist by training and a reputed wildlife photographer, author, and motivational speaker. Dr. Andheriya is a member of several government committees, including the National Tiger Conservation Authority, the State Boards of Wildlife of Maharashtra and Jammu and Kashmir, and the Gujarat State Lion Conservation Society. He was awarded the Carl Zeiss Conservation Award in 2008 and the UAA Institute of Chemical Technology Distinguished Alumnus Award in 2017. He is also a part of the organizing committee of the India Climate Collaborative, a member of the governing council of the Bombay Natural History Society, and is on the advisory council of the Balipara Foundation. So warm welcome to all three of you, as well as all the participants and audience who has tuned in. Without further ado, let's jump directly into our discussion. My first question is going to be for Anish. Before we get into compensation, let's give our audience a brief background into what human-wildlife conflict exactly entails, the different kinds, and then moving on to how is it directly connected to a compensation. Over to you.
Thank you, Shivangi, for the introduction. And I again welcome Akhileshwari and Dr. Ramgaonkar, who is a very dear friend of mine and one of the best officers that we have in Western India. So to start with, conflict itself, the word that has got attached to human-wildlife conflict, the word conflict itself is questionable because conflict is a perception. For instance, Dr. Ramgaonkar is the field director of Tadoba Andhari Tiger Reserve. He spends more than 70% of the time in the field. And when in the field, he comes in front of potentially dangerous animals like sloth bears, tigers, leopards, many times on foot. And you know that in forests like this, every now and then there are reports of attacks on people by large carnivores. If you are in South India, then you think about then you hear about attacks by elephants. More than 250, 260 people died of elephant attacks just in Chhattisgarh about a year ago. And so you keep hearing about these attacks, and that builds a perception. However, if you look at the forest department who works in the field, which means they walk into the forest pretty much every day, they are exposed to wild animals. Or you look at villagers. Now, India is a thickly populated nation. We have more than 870 protected areas in India. But the area of that protected area network is just 5% of India. And in many of these parks, you have people. So just to give you an example, in the tiger reserves of India, 3 million people live within the administrative boundary of the tiger reserve. So a tiger reserve is not a place which is sacrosanct for tigers and other wildlife. It also has people, and not few people, 3 million people, and nearly 100 million people live on the periphery of these tiger reserves. Nearly 300 million people are directly dependent on India's protected areas. And if you look at those people, they are in the forest pretty much every other day. They go in to collect minor forest produce, they go in to collect fuel wood, they sometimes use the forest for just moving from one place to another. So in their minds, there is no conflict. Because if there was conflict, then human beings and our track record, we will not allow animals to survive. But the fact that India has the best Asian elephant population, we have nearly 70% of all Asian elephants. India has the highest density of tigers on earth, one-horned rhinos, lions, leopards, very, very high concentration compared to the population of human beings that we have. So that itself tells you that people who live alongside these species don't think of them as conflict-causing animals. So human-wildlife conflict, actually WCT calls it human-wildlife interactions. So these are interactions. Some of them are negative, some of them are positive, and you have to categorize those interactions based on what has happened. So that's one thing that we have to remember. So we don't call human-wildlife conflict mitigation. We call human-wildlife interface management. And if we can change the perception of people, we are able to, and Dr. Ramgaonkar can bring his experience from the field, and he is holding charge of one of the most densely populated tiger habitat with 85 villages within Tadoba Tiger Reserve and a very huge territorial forest around Tadoba that has more than 1,000 villages. And the density of tigers outside Tadoba is almost comparable to inside. And in fact, the density of tigers in the corridors around Tadoba is more than 60% of all other tiger reserves. So how is it that people are living there? In the first place, if people thought of tigers and other animals as dangerous, they would have not allowed those animals to multiply. So that's one thing. Now the types of conflict. There are many types of conflict, and conflict, again, as I told you, is the perception. So there could be somebody may be annoyed if a bird is sitting on a tree with a car parked below the tree, and the bird sleeps there in the night, and you will have bird dropping on the car, and that itself is treated like conflict. And in several colonies in cities, I have seen people forcing the management committee to cut the tree or to move the birds out. So that is from the human side, but for the animal, they're just doing what they have done for millions of years. So these interactions happen in the water between potentially dangerous animals like crocodiles with people. It can also happen with fairly innocuous animals like dolphin, because when they go and catch fish, sometimes that fish is stuck in a net, and so they try and catch that fish. As a result, the net breaks and the fisherman pays the price because there is damage. And the fisherman therefore knows that the dolphin is not dangerous to him, but it is dangerous to his livelihood. So they start perceiving dolphin as a problem. When it comes to large carnivores, it's a no-brainer. Large carnivores are potentially dangerous. They obviously attack other species. There have been cases where people have died because of them. So that is one where it is between humans and carnivores. But there is another type of conflict which magnitude-wise, and all forest officers will agree, is between farmers and herbivores. People don't find deer dangerous. People don't find nilgai, which is an antelope, dangerous. They don't find pig dangerous. However, every single day when the crop is up, and if you are next to a forest area, herbivores, especially pigs, will come to feed on crops when it is standing. And the amount of damage that they can do, not by eating, but by trampling, is massive. So you can imagine 60% plus of Indians are farmers, and a lot of those farmers have their properties either in a corridor or near a forest. And so there is a constant interaction between herbivores and their crop fields. As a result, their yield goes down, and therefore they perceive these herbivores as dangerous. In fact, oftentimes during our surveys, we have seen that although tigers and leopards are carnivores, people are more irritated because of the herbivore, because it's impossible to measure the damage. So that interaction is quite dangerous. By the way, human beings, the fact that we have exploded in terms of our population, we are pretty much encroaching upon all natural habitats, whether it's a desert, it's a cold desert up in the mountains like Ladakh, or it's a forested area that we all know of in the peninsular India, or it's a mangroves, islands, or the sea. We are encroaching upon natural habitat, and very clearly there is a negative interactions from our side towards those species as a retaliation, or as the urge to survive on a planet which is dominated by people. You may have instances where animals have entered into human habitation. But in the first place, we have to understand that the world was mostly green and forested or different ecosystems about 500 years ago, and human habitations were discontinuous. Today, human habitation is contiguous with natural ecosystems as discontinuous spots, and therefore there is huge amount of interaction, and it's only going to go up exponentially as countries like us develop at a fast rate. So human wildlife interface management is going to be one of the most important fields which will make or break the perceptions of people. So what we do today is going to either destroy. If we ignore this, it's going to kill all these animals because people are going to finish them off. If we take right measures, then I have no doubt that India will have all these large mammals even into the next century.
Right. Thank you for that introduction, and also, bringing in the term interface management into this discussion. And what I'm listening is how perception plays such an important role in managing conflict, and how even media plays such an important role, to highlight stories of also coexistence and harmony while highlighting stories of conflict. And also, thank you for bringing in the topic of conflict in all different kinds of ecosystems and not just forests, oceans, urban areas, and so on. So moving on, I'd love to know the perspective of Akhileshwari and Dr. Jitendra from their perspective as a policy researcher, and from the government's point of view. What does human wildlife conflict or interface management mean to you? Perhaps we can start with Akhileshwari. So we heard the conservationist point of view, and I'd love to hear from both of you now.
So essentially, I've been trained as a lawyer and I've been working as a policy researcher for about 4.5 years. So when we look at a certain law or a policy, there are a couple of different things that we assess. So when it comes to human-wildlife conflict, the first thing is, what is the amount of compensation? As lawyers, we don't have the mandate to question the amount of compensation, but we can and do assess whether the criteria is objective or not. And another thing that we look at is the timelines. Is there a timeline within which the government is supposed to pay this compensation to persons who've been affected by human wildlife negative interaction? And then you look at what the process is, and if there are high transaction costs to filing a claim. For instance, how much paperwork is there? How much evidence do you have to provide? Do you know who the officers are that you have to send this claim to? All of that. And the last thing that you look at is whether there is a grievance redressal system. So I will come to India's legal framework for this in the later question. But for now, let's just say none of these questions are answered well in what is our policy right now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And also to follow up with that, taking a step back, can you tell us what comes before compensation, right? Where does compensation interact with conflict? Because compensation is one of the many tools.
So essentially, compensation comes in as a mitigatory measure. So human nature is essentially, you've been hurt, your crops have been damaged, or your family members been killed. So your reaction is to hurt back, to seek revenge. What compensation does is it's a buffer. It's saying you have been injured, this is harm, we recognize it, and here's compensation to mitigate it. So that's where compensation comes in general. What was the other question?
No, that's about it. Thank you so much. Dr. Jitendra, please let us know your perspective from the government. Very interesting to hear that.
Yeah, as it is very evident, the wildlife in India is not existing in isolation, but in a context of large-scale human habitations. And in this scenario, wildlife very existence depends on the goodwill of the people, particularly the communities that surround our national parks and sanctuaries, mainly farmers. Farmers, tribal people, forest dwelling communities, people dependent on the forest for their livelihood. So these are the communities which need to look at wildlife in a positive way for their existence. In a scenario where this perspective changes, the way of looking at them changes to negative, then whole lot of problems can start. And in our scenario, it is mainly a socio-economic problem. From the government perspective, we are always trying to balance welfare of the people and conservation. And whenever there is a conflict between the two, probably the welfare of the people would take precedence in most of the cases. So we always try to balance the two. And when we say that it's a socio-economic problem, we need to understand that the people who are affected from these negative interactions with wildlife are poorest of the poor. We know a lot of people visit wildlife areas and see for pleasure, but when we talk about people who have to live there day in and day out, and they have to conduct some activities which are part of their livelihood, and for that they have to venture into forest, they have to depend on forest for part of it. So they have no option but to interact with the ecosystem surrounding them. And in that case, if uh, they interact negatively, animals damage their farms, attack them. So they tend to look at ecosystems in a different way, not as a provider, but as a damaging to their livelihood and existence. In this scenario, they get into maybe anger, frustration, retaliatory action. Then, but if we really want to help them in this scenario and try to achieve coexistence and our conservation objectives, then this interface needs to be managed in a strategic way. And only compensation cannot do that. We need to look at all the ways by which their existence can be facilitated, their dependence can be reduced. They can be provided alternatives, so that whatever may be the cost of existing in a wildlife area, so the benefit should outweigh the cost. So if that kind of scenario we can create, then probably we have a good future. And whatever efforts government is making in this direction, it is all in these directions. We are trying to reduce the cost and trying to increase the benefits of people. And though there is a long way to go, but in certain areas we have been able to do that through tourism, through some other benefits, government schemes, prioritizing them, and trying to give them a message that since you are affected by this problem, then you are being looked at by government in a special way, and some priorities are being given to them. So that's what we are trying to do, and it is working pretty well in some areas. And we need to definitely work more on every aspect in every area, but in some areas we are now beginning to see some kind of positive results because of these interventions, and we know what things works, what things don't work, and we have choices before us, what things to scale up and what interventions to make.
Right. Thank you for that. And this actually brings me to a question I was going to ask much later. But since we've come to interventions that the government is carrying out, to manage human-wildlife conflict, I want to ask all three of you, and we'll start with Dr. Jitendra itself. So compensation is dispersed after the conflict that has already taken place, right? So in essence, it is a tool to prevent further conflict after damage is already done. So compensation, like you mentioned, needs to go hand in hand with a lot of other interventions to prevent the first instance of conflict in the first place. So what are some successful mitigation measures that all three of you have seen? And it would be great if, y'all could also shed some light on some live examples or case studies that y'all have seen on ground. We can start with Dr. Jitendra Akhilesh.
Yeah, I can give some examples from Tadoba landscape. We have around 90 to 100 villages in the periphery of Tadoba Andhari Tiger Reserve. And most of these villages were dependent and still in part dependent on forest-based livelihood. Here, 2-3 interventions over the last 10 years have given good results. One of them is 100% LPG connections to the villages. So that has largely reduced the people who go venture into the forest for collecting firewood, and a potential source of conflict has been taken care of. And you can say it has impacted in a very positive way. And the kind of conflict that we see today in the areas has been on a much lower level. Second intervention has been using these areas for non-extractive benefits like tourism, where people don't actually go to collect produce, but they just go for a certain period, take tourists. They have created some kind of homestays. Then there are various facilities which people can just enjoy and come back. And economic benefits of these activities have reached people, and they realize that they can get benefited in much better way by protecting the wildlife rather than exploiting them. or damaging them. So, and there are several other measures to mitigate conflict, not to say per se prevent it, because some kind of conflict is bound to happen in an area where there is, you can say, very number of animals are more, density is more, not only of animals but human beings also. So some kind of conflict is going to be there, but we can reduce those situations into a positive interface where people do see that animals are present, but they do not interact negatively, they do not damage them, and they see them as potential benefactors rather than damaging to their livelihood.
Right. So it ultimately boils down to livelihoods and economic benefits for them. Akhilesh, would you like to add something from your experience? You're on mute.
Sorry.
Alright.
So one example that I can think of is this elephant information system that was implemented in the Annamalai Hills. So because this is an area which has a lot of wild elephants, the interaction between humans and wildlife is quite high. So one way that they reduce the number of deaths from say 3 a year to just one person a year, even that's fine, but still it's lesser, is by using this information system where they broadcasted the movement of elephants on TV, on radio, and they also moved to SMS, so that there was a whole bunch of knowledge about where these elephants were moving, and so that people would not go into these areas. So that's one thing that I can think of.
That's a very interesting example using communication and digital technology to mitigate conflict. Thanks for that. Anish, you're on mute.
Yeah, so a lot of important points have already been discussed. So I will probably focus on the kind of technological advancements that is helping solve conflict. For instance, looking at dolphins now. Dolphins, as I said, are not they are predators, but they never attack human beings. So there is actually zero interaction really between humans and dolphins. But they get stuck in the nets, they get drowned in the nets, and we know that they use sonar. And so if some technology can be used so that there are emitters, sound emitters, which are in that frequency that the dolphin understands, then you could ensure that the dolphins don't come close to nets so that they don't get entangled, they don't destroy or get drowned. So that's one way. Then there is what is called EI. So it's an electronic eye basically that is placed, which is nothing but thermal cameras that can detect heat, and those cameras are very powerful. They are installed on towers, and they can see almost 2.5 to 3 kilometers on all sides. They keep revolving, and there is a control room, so they keep telecasting what these cameras are seeing in the night, and they normally pick all the warm-blooded animals, which means human beings going in, elephants going out. So this is useful in areas where there are elephants, because if you look at any news item or you do any research on conflict related issues, then elephants actually take the cake, because they have large areas that they roam in. The range is huge, plus their corridors have been hampered badly, largely because of roads, railways, canal systems. So their old ancient migratory paths are all now slowly getting cut off. So they are getting disoriented, and because they need almost 150 kgs of food every day and water also in large quantities, they move out. So that if we know that elephants are moving out of the forest in the night, some of them are habitual raiders, which means they go in the night, feed, and then come back into the forest. So those kind of things, if they can see well in advance that they are moving in a certain direction, then they can be herded back. Then there could be solar fencing is being done in certain areas. I'm not saying that all these things that I'm suggesting is a silver bullet, because there is a lot of maintenance that is required. There is a cost attached to it. So if a farmer who is a marginalized farmer and has a half an acre land, then a solar fence may not be feasible for him, because it will cost some money. and government can subsidize it, but they cannot do it for so many people. And so, but solar fences have helped, especially in areas. I mean, if there are wild pigs, then solar fences also don't work. But if there are, herbivores other than wild pigs, then solar fences do work. There are certain sounds that are used to keep animals away. There are lights that people have used, very, very bright light shining in the eyes of the animal as soon as the animal cuts a beam. So there could be an infra beam, like you have a camera trap, you have such traps that you put, and when an animal moves in, they can't see those traps, but there is an infrared beam that they cut. As soon as that happens, it switches on the light or sound, and those shoo the animal away. Now, these are all, mind you, symptomatic. So what Dr. Ramgaonkar said is a long-term solution where you are actually tackling the root cause, which means you are keeping people away from the forest by providing them alternatives so that conflicts, the situation, the interactions go down. And if interactions go down, then conflict will go down. So that is always the number one option. All other options are useful, but on their own, they will not help. So if you do whatever I said, it will tell the people that animals are coming. It will tell the forest department that they need to come in action. But animals don't understand us. They will do what they want to do. And oftentimes they are smart enough to outsmart us. So the biggest solution is to provide an insulation to people through livelihood programs, through training programs. There is one more thing that we all have to do as conservationists, as lawyers, as forest departments, that we need to be able to influence the behavior of people. It's the behavior. It's many times we are the slave of our culture. And so there are, see, if I want tandoori roti, so I may stay in Bombay, but if I go to a hotel and I'll ask for tandoori roti because I like the wood flavor. Now, the moment I ask for something like that, you will need wood, and the wood means the forest will go. And if the forest gets degraded, then conflict will go more, because animals in general like to be in undisturbed areas. But once disturbance goes to a certain point, those animals will get habituated to disturbance, and then it will take no time for the animal to move in human dominated areas. Otherwise, in areas where the forest is good, even if there are huge habitations of people around outside, animals seldom go into those areas. So research has shown that degradation increases the ability of the animal to withstand human presence, and that is the beginning of the interaction. So we need to ensure that there is a invisible but extremely strong division between humans and people. In some places like Bombay, it is possible because Sanjay Gandhi National Park is surrounded by buildings, and yet you don't have any conflict from leopards. But in villages, where villagers have to go to their fields, villagers have to sometimes walk into the forest to answer the nature's call, which is the most basic things. There, these things are not so easy. So there you need to work with those people, improve their livelihoods, and also try and influence their behavior so that they can reduce activities when certain animals are active. So it's by partitioning, it's called temporal partitioning between people through behavior change, so that people are not out after 7 o'clock in the evening, because tigers, sloth bears, a lot of other carnivores, even some of the herbivores are active in the night. So if people don't move out, then those attacks will fall drastically. So it's not easy. Everybody is grappling with it. But the good thing is, because there are so many different solutions and technologies available, everybody has a role to play. Lawyers have a role to play, engineers have a role to play, conservationists, and pretty much the media. So it's a field which needs different perspectives, and therefore people from different walks of lives should actually start inputting in it. Then we'll be able to probably solve this.
Right. Thank you for that. It highlights the interconnections between everything, right? Like sanitation to behavior change to legal measures. Since we're talking about compensation today, which is one solution to mitigating conflict, let's move on to that and discuss what are the problems with compensation today in India, and also how is it benefiting mitigation. Let's start with Akhileshwari for this one.
Yeah. So essentially, we had a Vidhi as well as CWS created a project wherein we analyzed the compensation mechanism for human-wildlife conflict in Karnataka. Now, the thing that we have to realize about human-wildlife conflict and the law is there is no comprehensive national policy or law for compensation in India. And the states also do not have laws. So what gets done is these compensation processes are made through government directions and circulars. And the problem with government directions and circulars is that they can be changed at the whim of a change in government. There's no process whereby it has to go to the parliament if you have to amend it, right? So that's one critical problem that's there in India when it comes to the law. And when you come to different policies that states have, they're all pretty much the same thing. Just the different compensation amounts change, and perhaps how injuries, how much injury and how much should be paid changes. But essentially, the findings of this report are they apply to all the states. So when you think of filing a claim, you look at different things, right? So the problem with this entire system is it's riddled with arbitrariness and discretion and bureaucratic hurdles, which makes it extremely hard for people to get compensation. So I'll just take you through the steps of what happens. So first you file a claim. How do you file a claim? So every district in Karnataka where human wildlife conflict happens has a different form that needs to be filled in. And each of these forms has a different requirement. For instance, some need thumbprints, some don't need thumbprints, some need signatures, some can only be filled in the presence of a forest officer. And none of this is written anywhere. So it's all arbitrary and it's as per the forest officers of each of those districts. Then you look at something like a lot of these claims get rejected because the photographs of the damage is not as per their requirement. But where is this requirement given? Nowhere. So they want glossy photos, they want matte photos, they want this size photos, that size photos, but nobody knows. And who are the people that have to file these claims? They're extremely socio-economically disadvantaged. We have to understand that. And then you come to the officers, right? So range officers essentially go and assess the damage and all of that. So, but in say one Karnataka direction, that you can't. First of all, finding all of this is really difficult. As lawyers, as conservationists, even for us, it's effort, and like people on the ground will not have this knowledge. Then you look at the officers. So there's, for example, if a person dies because of human wildlife compensation, a human wildlife conflict, he needs to get compensation. Now, who does this claim go to? According to one Karnataka directive, this claim goes to 3 different officers. It goes to the deputy conservator, it goes to the conservator, and it goes to the chief conservator. Now, if you have these many people, everybody is going to pass the buck and say, it's not my problem. The other person also has a responsibility. You go do this. So this is something that needs to change. Now, when you look at compensation itself, how is it calculated? I'll tell you the different problems that are there. So Karnataka has one list of crops, and whatever, if there is damage to these crops, then you get paid compensation. But what happens if a person has planted crops that are not on this list? Then the forest officer can easily say, this is not on the list, you're not getting compensated. And that is not an exhaustive list. And then you look at something like cattle. So say cattle get injured or killed by wildlife. So how are you compensating them? So Karnataka has a blanket 10,000 rupees for oxen and cows, and it has goats and sheep, it has like 5,000 rupees. So there's no differentiation on the basis of what kind of animals are these. Are these native, non-native? Are they milk giving? What is the age of the animal? None of that is considered. So something that we suggest in the report is that compensation should be paid according to the average of the market price of these animals for the last 3 years or 5 years. That's for the government to decide. And then another thing that you see when you look at the compensation policies in Karnataka is that there are ranges of payments that can be made. For instance, you can be paid 3,000 to 5,000 rupees, say for crop damage. There's nothing that tells the forest officer that these are the criteria that need to be filled for you to give them this much amount of money. So essentially, it's again discretion. How much you give a person is essentially entirely up to them. And the last thing that I want to point out that is that there are no timelines for how fast this compensation is dispersed, or there's no timeline for how fast these claims need to be filled. So, for example, if a person's killed or disabled entirely, and you give him compensation after 1 year, what happens to that person's livelihood? He isn't able to cultivate his land anymore. His property is damaged. Something like this has to be looked into, which is why you need a law that specifies all of this. Currently, the way these policies are made, the process is essentially the punishment. Yeah.
Right. Thank you for that elaborate description of the process. And I think it's the correct time to come to Dr. Jitendra and, learn from his perspective as an implementer, as a forest officer of these, circulars and directives. It would be great if you could, tell us what are the problems that you face as an officer who's implementing these circulars and directives, and how much of this actually happens on ground. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? That'll make for an interesting conversation.
Some of the issues like a lack of a national law or something, that is definitely true. But various states have their own laws. And as far as Maharashtra is concerned, a lot of improvements have happened in the process of filing claims, the timelines, and the amount of compensation. There are guidelines and criteria which have been decided by the relevant departments. Like in case of cattle, it's animal husbandry department. In case of crops, it is agriculture department. So those standards, guidelines are generally followed. And amount also has increased quite a bit in last few years. If you talk about compensation in case of human death, ideally we cannot compensate human death. Whatever we can give is just ex gratia, and just to mitigate the damage to livelihood of that person. Suppose a person is a only bread earner of the family, then the kind of support that is required, so government just tries to mitigate some of it. But definitely it can be segregated into different cases. Some kind of other support can be given. Suppose a person doesn't die and leads into permanent disability, then what kind of support he should be given, whether he can be given regular support for some time. So those are the things we can look at. It can definitely be improved, but over the period of time, certain improvements in filing claims, timelines have definitely been made. In Maharashtra, most of the claims are settled into say 15 days. Technology has come in. Claims can be filed from a mobile phone, and it can be monitored regularly. In case of human death, maximum weeks time claims are settled. So those kind of things have come in. Even budgetary provisions, Maharashtra is a state where even you can give when there is no budget. There are negative budget distribution system allows you to draw when even there is no funds in the system. So those kind of things have happened. It is improving, and some aspects can improve. Maybe the list can be made more exhaustive. The kind of crops that are included into that can be made into that. Some segregation of quality of livestock can be done, and compensation for the loss of livelihood can be done. So those things can be improved, but I think we cannot really compensate completely the kind of damage that happens. The claims, it is not that 100% people file claims. Sometimes people do not even file claims when they feel that the damage is not to that extent, and it leads to loss of productivity, and that affects in the longer run. And you can say there is less drive or less investment in increasing productivity when people live in an area where they feel that their crop is going to be perpetually threatened by herbivores and other wildlife. So there is a tendency not to invest in increasing productivity. So that is also something which affects the long-term development of that area. So we need to look into these aspects also. But over the period of time, in last say 10 years or so, things have improved in this regard.
That's great to know. A follow-up to that question, if from the point of view of a forest officer, if you were to say one thing that needs to improve drastically when it comes to compensation, what would you say that needs to improve? Is it something that it needs to become a standard law for every state, or maybe training for forest officers on how calculation needs to be done? What is it according to you that needs to change drastically?
I think a standard law would not be very good, because we have different situations in different states, and whatever laws that we have state-wise, they generally take care of the situation for that state, and there is a flexibility to change that, and it has been happening. A lot of things have changed in the recent times, and regarding timelines, a right to compensation has been included in the right to services in forest departments, and in a way it has become an act. So whenever there is a compensation claim, timeline is fixed by right to service act, and people are entitled to get that. So those things are there, but definitely I think with the inclusion of more technology in the process, things can get better. The filing of claims and receiving compensation in the bank accounts directly without going to the government offices, if that can be done, on which several states are actually working today. If it is done in near future, then probably the process will get very streamlined, very transparent, and people will feel at least that mitigating impact of compensation provisions, which is intended for, that will achieve our service purpose.
Right. Thank you. Akhileshwari, would you like to comment on the point about not needing a standard law for compensation?
See, what he's saying is not wrong. Each state has a different wildlife situation, and it's okay. It doesn't have to be one national policy. But what is necessary is a legislation that does not give discretionary powers to the government. And the process needs to be made simple so that compensation can be given and taken easily. And for every state, it's okay. We can tweak the law, but like the basics, such as who's the officer, how do you file a claim, what evidence do you need, all of this needs to be laid down in the law so that people are not confused and just, they're discouraged from filing a claim in the first place because it's too complicated. So, yeah.
Right. Thanks for that. Anish, you want to add on to what both of them have said? You're on mute.
I cannot, agree more about what they have said, but I will take it in a different direction, where I feel compensation in the head of a villager, because the animal is a wild animal, they think that the forest department is responsible for the wild animal. What we need to change there is to understand that animals and the forests are essential for human life to survive on this planet, right? So that seems like an overarching, very profound statement, but how does that translate when it comes to the understanding of a villager? And that can happen if departments converge on the fact that if there is a conflict situation, the agriculture department, the tribal department, the irrigation department, the forest department, the transportation department. So these are all departments which influence rural landscapes, and there are many more. They have to come together and take the burden of the forest department. The forest department's job is to secure our forests and natural ecosystems, because our water, because our oxygen, because our temperature regulatory things, and all the other ecosystem services that we are getting. So to say that this is your problem is unfair, and it's not going to help. And so this is a far bigger problem, and it's not the problem of the department alone. And that if that changes, and if villagers living around forest areas, if they are compensated through various schemes, which means at least in Maharashtra, there is Janvan Yojana, Shama Prasad Yojana, where if you are in the corridor of a tiger reserve, and the corridor that is connecting one tiger reserve with another of another source tiger population, then that village, because it is right there and because it is living alongside people, have special benefits. So when that happens, such villages don't turn hostile towards animals, because they understand that it is the government is alive to the fact that because there is wildlife, because there are wildlife laws, there is an opportunity cost that they are paying, and that is being compensated. And I can tell you one thing is that India, if we cannot solve conflict or this interaction problem in India, there is no hope on this planet, because India, I can tell you, is the only country where such high human densities and high wildlife, and that to large mammal densities, coexist. The fact that it does, it is because of the resilience and the culture of the communities that live here. So rather than looking at them as victim, if you involve them so that they can also take the burden off. So currently what is happening is there is a perception that the forest department is not efficient, or we won't get the money, or there are some elements within the villages who are trying to instigate some people. So these are very usual things, and that happens everywhere. Villagers are unhappy, but if through certain programs, villagers also realize that they need wild animals as much as their crops, then they will behave much more responsibly. Sometimes interactions happen because people are casual, and so that needs to change. So compensation again is a solution for the symptom. Compensation is not the solution for the interaction, and that one must understand. So as a conservationist, as Wildlife Conservation Trust, we are not trying to firefight and see how we can compensate somebody so that they are happy today, but tomorrow again the same issue comes up, people are going to be even more angry. And so what we have to, as government departments, so different ministries have to come together. We have to have dialogues with people, because people understand the importance of forest for them. People don't destroy forest because they hate it. People destroy it because there is livelihood issues. So the problem is somewhere else, and everybody is looking at this interaction as a problem. So it's like, very simply put, you have a headache, and all that we are doing is giving a Ceridon to the person instead of finding out whether the headache is because of eye problem, or do you have a tumor in the head, or you have indigestion. So we need to change the way, and while we do that, obviously we will have to continue to compensate, but we have to reach a level where villagers will invest money so that their crops are insured, because they know that they are near the jungle. They need to ensure, and rather than eliminating those animals, because remember bees, remember butterflies, remember so many other insects who are also considered as threats to people, are being killed. So we are looking at large mammals all the time, but there is different kind of conflict that happens where butterfly, which means that caterpillars destroying crops, so they want to put pesticides. When that happens, nearly 40% of our crops and our vegetables are still pollinated by wild insects. And so when we start fighting this battle, and mind you, this is a losing battle. If we keep fighting this battle with nature, we are going to lose. So compensation is not going to solve. We have to change the perspective of the people and of the government. So that's where the solutions will actually come out.
Right. Thank you for that. And while, since you mentioned honeybees, I know we are focusing on forests, but a question that comes to me right now is, how do you tackle these interactions in urban areas, right, where such policies and laws don't exist, more than compensating humans in protection of these wild animals, like say honeycombs, for example. They're removed regularly from buildings because they're they pose a threat. So it would be great to hear from any of you on how human-wildlife interaction and management can improve in urban areas as well. Anish, Akhleshwari.
I have a short answer to this. Yeah, we need to focus on everything. However, I think the city understands policies better um, uh, because of the kind of education that most people have. So there, it will have to be through law. So we cannot leave gaps in these laws. Currently, there is. So anybody can come and, as you said, burn the entire honeycomb, and that honeybee is actually pollinating an area of maybe 500 square kilometers, that one comb, right? So we need to use law. And also, I think in cities or in villages, one thing that works well is awareness campaigns, because many times, and as a forest officer, Dr. Ramgaonkar will understand and agree that many times there are schemes available the government has thought through. So government has been thinking, we have some fantastic acts, but the people on the ground don't understand how to benefit or how to avail of those. So sometimes it is that the knowledge or the books that are there are not available for people. And so if a good awareness campaign is done, and it is done in schools, in colleges, in cities, I'm sure the next generation is far more alive to all these issues than my generation was. The same thing applies to villagers. In fact, there has to be some NGOs can go in and actually improve their understanding of the constitution also, and all these acts, because then, and today is an important day, it's the Constitution Day of India. So we need to somehow make sure that the awareness levels about our acts become very, very crystal clear, and also with it the rights. So this acts, rights, human rights, animal welfare, and the knowledge about various schemes that the government have, those I think will help move in a certain direction.
Right. Thanks for that. So since we're talking about compensation, I'd love to hear from Dr. Jitendra on, what do you think is the capacity presently of the forest department and forest guards in terms of their understanding of the whole compensation system? And where do you think would the forest department benefit from in terms of, say, training or resources or capacity building when it comes to compensation as well as in human wildlife management?
The forest department is very confident, and at the moment, all the challenges, though it is the magnitude of challenges is more than what the forest force can handle, but still the kind of response forest department is able to give, it is fantastic, and we have been able to address management issues. But at the same time, it is more about changing people's perceptions, where forest department is probably not able to be that successful. And changing perceptions is not only forest department's job, it depends on a host of other factors. It also depends on what people have, the kind of dependence that people have. If you are not able to reduce their dependence, then whatever measures that you take, because you are not going to compensate them 100% anytime. We are just trying to give them a part of it, and because monetary compensation is just a part of it, there are other things. Suppose a farmer gets his crop damaged, it's not just that his crop is damaged, he is attached to the farm in more than one ways, and he may get his money, but he may not get the food grains that he used to grow, and dependent on his own survival, own subsistence. So there are several factors to it, and this perception can only change when people living in and around forest are treated differently. They are given, they cannot be put in the same bracket where cities or other population is put. Unless we treat them separately, unless we put value to their sacrifices by virtue of their location that they make, because anyone who is living in and around forest making a kind of sacrifice which even if he's not getting his crop is not damaged, or he's not getting attacked by wildlife, he's still making certain kind of sacrifices, be it in terms of development, be it in terms of health facilities that he gets. So there are several things attached to it, and we need to look at those people in a different way, and government has to come up with some special provisions, like Shama Prasad Mukherjee Yojana, whatever Maharashtra has implemented. It is just one example, but at the same time, we need to look at several other provisions which today we do not have. We need to make them. We need to award or appreciate the areas with more forest, more wildlife. We need to give them incentives. We need to give them more money for planning, and the kind of solutions that are required for these areas may be different from the areas where wildlife is not there. It may cost more, but it has to be given there, and then only we can think of changing people's perception, and whatever we are envisaging in terms of conservation goals, then only we can talk about it. Because unless those needs are taken care of, if you go to village, it's not very easy to talk about conservation. We need to first talk about their livelihood. We need to talk about the agriculture, the facilities, the basic things, schooling, health, and then only you can talk about conservation, because they are dependent on several other things, which, and they are disadvantaged in several ways that need to be appreciated first before we ask them to do further sacrifice on their part.
Right. Thank you for that. This response makes me think of multiple questions that I have on behavior change and perception. But to benefit our participants and our topic, I have two questions for Akhileshwari on compensation. Since we spoke about provisions that do not exist right now, that we do not have, Akhileshwari, we'd love to know, through your research and through the report that you authored on the need for the compensation law. Two questions. One is, when you compared states, and if you did, which states were faring better in terms of their performance with compensation, which states were not? And second, what would you recommend, right? But since you're suggesting that we have a national standard compensation law just as a guidance for states to further build upon, what are the recommendations that you came up with?
So essentially, we didn't really compare a lot of different states. We just looked at Karnataka, but it's not really that Karnataka is not giving compensation. If you look at statistics, some 38 crores were disbursed as compensation just for one kind of damage in like 2019. It's just the way that it is getting disbursed is very shrouded in secrecy and arbitrariness. When it comes to recommendations, we've essentially said there's two ways that compensation can be given. One is you create an entire new system whereby you specify the officers and you specify grievous redressal mechanisms, and you have a separate thing. Or like Sir was saying, we do have this law called Sakala, whereby citizens are entitled to compensation if they've been if there's a case where they are entitled to compensation. And in that, wildlife claims are covered, and there is a redressal mechanism. But the question is, how accessible is this to persons who have been affected by human wildlife conservation conflict? But yeah, so essentially, our recommendations, there were a whole host of recommendations, in the sense of we defined exactly who these officers had to be. There was no ambiguity as to there was like 3 or 4 different officers. So for a claim of say crop damage and property damage, all of that, there was only a 2-tier system. One was the range officer, then it was the deputy conservator. But for example, if it's a human death, we prescribed a 3-step standard. So that because the compensation here is far higher, which is like 10 lakhs. And for timelines, we've prescribed timelines in the sense of for every claim that has to be filed, it has to be filed within 7 days of the incident. And we provided what all the evidences that are necessary to be given are as well, which could include say Aadhaar, which could include say the property documents for the area that was damaged. And say if there's a the death of an animal, then a veterinary certificate. If there's a injury to a person, then a government doctor has to give you a certificate. All of this has been mentioned in this proposed law. So essentially, this report gives you how to make the law. Like literally, there's nothing else you have to do. Like there's no application of mind as such. It's there. Just take it. Do something with it. But yeah, we'll come to that other question. I tell you. Yeah, that's about it.
Great. Thank you so much. Moving on, since we heard from the research point of view and the government point of view, Anish, could you tell us what role do NGOs on ground, as well as citizens and first responders play, right, when a conflict occurs? And even what role do citizens and NGOs play on ground to mitigate and prevent conflict?
So several roles. In fact, NGOs, if they are science-based NGOs, there are different types of NGOs who are looking at it from the social side. Some people are research-based. So it depends on what your strengths are. First of all, stick to your strengths. So if you know people, then you work with them, try and be the bridge between, say, existing schemes. And so it's just the linking the two, which means what you do, how fast can you get it, talk to the government, talk to certain officers, and make sure that the delivery of compensation is expedited, that there is no undue delay. There will be some amount of time, but otherwise that should be cut off. So that role can be played, and NGOs can play the role of a catalyst. Another important role is in terms of mitigation. So there are some NGOs also around tiger reserves. Always you will have a couple of NGOs who are good at rescue work. So when there is an interaction, an animal is in a situation where there are thousands of people who are wanting to see that animal. Nowadays, they want to take a selfie with the animal. It's getting even more dangerous. So how fast can that animal be separated from people will determine the kind of perception that will develop in the minds of people. So to be able to solve the conflict or the rescue operation, so there, no matter how much the government tries, there will be a limitation. So if there are NGOs who they can get trained, they should build capacity in them so that they can become an extension of the government. And that will help, because many times, because of perceptions, people don't allow the forest department to do their duty. But if there is an NGO who understands both sides, they can actually reduce the friction that's there between people. It's very important to manage crowds during these situations, especially in terms of elephants and people. Oftentimes, all you need to do is keep the people away, animals will move away. This I'm not saying where an animal is entered to feed on something. That's a very different thing. But many a times, most of our so-called conflict situations are when animals are just trespassing. And there people go to see that animal and they get disoriented, and then it gets into a snowball. So that I think they can do. There are a lot of NGOs, a lot of lawyers like Akhileshwari. They have a role to play. As you can see, the kind of surveys that are done in an unambiguous manner, so that to see the lacunas, and laws are not carved in stone ever. They have to continuously rework on them, amend them with changing times. And as people's perceptions change, as people's economic conditions change, the way they in a way interpret nature also changes. So a law that was enacted 50 years ago, and if it continues now, then that's going to create problems. So that has to be worked on, and therefore again, individuals, lawyers, or you said citizens can play a role. Awareness building is a big thing. Forest department, and as Dr. Ramgaonkar mentioned, that department is good at what it does. It's not very good at creating, doing awareness. So a lot of ad agencies who are putting out public interest ads, they can go one step further and provide their services to the forest department so that they can help interpret the forest department's work in front of the larger audience, the common man. So we all see some ads, and Amul ads, the kind of stuff that they do with just one line, and we are all looking forward to an ad like that. Those kind of things. So people who are in the field of art, people who are in the field of ads, even filmmakers, they have a very big role to play. Some right kind of movies. We saw that movie Sherni that came. It is a very, very realistic movie. It's not exactly what a certain incident that happened, but it is as real as a movie can be. So things like that. So therefore, there is unending amount of inputs that people can give, and people. The most important thing is to not point fingers at different agencies. And it's very easy to, on a lunch table, you will have people who say, government is like this forest department is never going to be efficient. Yeah, police hamesha last scene mein hi aati hai. Now this is all ingrained. That just stop talking, do something, and then you will realize that once you interact with villagers and the government, you will yourself see which pigeonhole you fit, so that you can start making a difference on the ground. So it's very important to first understand yourself and then start spreading the right information. There is no limit at all to what people can do in this field.
Thank you so much for that. So we have opened up the chat to questions from participants, and we've also received some questions from viewers on YouTube. A couple of interesting ones coming in, and any of you, please take them up. The first one that we have is something that I really like. What changes can be brought about in agricultural practices to change this? I'm assuming this means to reduce human-wildlife conflict. Dr. Jitendra, would you like to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah. Definitely, some cropping pattern changes can lead to positive changes in a landscape. Particularly, if you look at the area where I am working, it's an area where cotton is grown as a crop. The nature of the crop is such that it can provide hiding space for large carnivores like tigers, and it becomes difficult to operate those, harvest those crops when they mature. So if pattern is changed to tree-based crops, probably we can have a better situation. But at the same time, just making these small changes may not work in the long run. In a long run, we probably have to think about, at least in some areas, about a uniform income for certain communities which are living around protected areas, which can be a basic income, and probably after that they would not even need to file claims. In some small areas in Tadoba landscape, we have tried to encourage farmers to just leave their land, probably do some less intensive agriculture, and per acre compensation from the Conservation Foundation of Tadoba we pay to them. So we have been able to get into that kind of agreement with some certain farmers, but it has not happened to the scale where it can make a real impact. But at the policy level, probably it's time to think about such kind of interventions at a much larger scale, so that large areas can become free from intensive practices, and interface can be reduced.
Right. Akhleshwari, Anish, would you like to add to this, or I can move on to the next question?
I'm sorry.
Would you like to add to this, or I can move on to the next question?
Move on to the next question.
Okay. Great. So since we spoke so much about perception and behavior change, one question that has come in is there any work or research being done that addresses social values and beliefs in relation to interaction of human communities with wildlife? I think I'd also like to add to this, since we're discussing perception, the role of media. How has it affected the work that you do, and what role does media play to how has media increased the negative perception of wildlife? I think that is the question. Dr. Jitendra, would you like to begin again, and then I can move on to Anish to answer this one.
Media definitely has a big role to play, because whatever stories happen in a small area of landscape reach the larger audience because of media, and the way it is portrayed can be a you can say can be a base on which perceptions are made. So when conflict with tigers is portrayed as a simple conflict is portrayed as a, you can say, havoc created by a man-eater or something. So people look at it in a very different way, and the image of wildlife is created in such a way that it is considered a threat to everybody's life. And there can be retaliation based on that, and it becomes difficult for the authorities in such areas to go and make their interventions so that the conflict can be reduced when the perception base is like this. But if the media tries to educate people, tries to educate in scientific way, tries to educate about the right kind of things to do in such areas, right kind of behavior, what people should do in such areas, so it can make a lot of difference. We have seen that in Mumbai, where there used to be a conflict, still there is to some certain degrees, but the kind of reaction of media has changed over the period of time. The kind of reporting has changed. People have understood that it is a part of coexistence. It's a part of changing behavior. It's not that every animal that you see is going to create conflict. It's about changing certain basic behavior of people who are living in that area, and it has made a good difference. And the same kind of things are happening in the rural parts of the country. There are incidences where reporting is bad and it creates a negative impact, but in wherever there is a good reporting, science based reporting, or educative kind of reporting, definitely things are better, and it can definitely get better than what it is today.
Thank you for that. Anish, would you like to add on to this? You're on mute.
Yeah, so I'm saying the media question, I think it's already been asked. I'll get into the behavior change thing, because a Wildlife Conservation Trust is trying to unravel the secrets of the mind of a group of people, not individuals. So it's social psychology, not clinical psychology. So it's when you people interact, when they're in large groups, perceptions develop in a certain way. People are impressionable, they get influenced if they keep hearing the same thing. So if 50 people say the wrong thing and one person actually says the right thing, mostly people believe what those 50 people say, right? So one needs to work on that. So we need to understand, and once you go into the village, you realize that socioeconomic, first is to understand what is it that the people are earning and what are their aspirations, because aspirations is everything. You may have, you may be the richest person in a country, yet you want to become more rich, or you could be a destitute, yet you will be satisfied. But there is an aspiration always. So first is to understand aspiration. It is also important to understand the perception that people have about law, people have about wildlife, people have about the forest department. So many times it is a very, very deep rooted, what do we call pigeonholing that happens, where people have already formed an impression, no matter what happens, they will not give the benefit of doubt to the outside. So we need to understand, and that cannot happen through a question answer format. You need to have very deep dive, which means scientists, social scientists, conservationists, researchers have to go and stay in the village, understand people in a very organic fashion. They have to understand motivations of people. And oftentimes when you do that, for instance, there is a project that we are doing in around Tadoba, where as Dr. Ramgavkar said, that the government has given cylinders, gas cylinders, and subsidies on gas cylinders, so that people don't have to depend on fuel wood. And therefore their visitation to the forest will go down, because they don't now need food, but wood. So what happens is, so as per the government, that scheme has worked, and definitely that scheme has brought down consumption of fuel wood. However, once you go there and you still see there is conflict, that's when you go in, you understand why is there. If they are not going to the jungle, you realize that 40% of their wood requirements, fuel wood, has gone down because of the cylinders. Because cylinders are, finally you have to pay money after a point. It's not free, and wood is still free. 60%, nearly 55% to 60% of their consumption is because of heating water. So even in the hottest parts of India, there is a predisposition towards using hot water, because it's behavioral. So once you go and understand that people may cook food, but for water, they are not going to use gas cylinders, LPG. So there they will still go and get a log, and that log keeps burning from morning till the evening, and they are continuously heating water. Whenever they need it, they will take water from there. So that's when we said, let's go and figure out. So that behavioral understanding, and then we realized that their visitation to the forest has dropped, but not so much, because many times women want their time, personal time, because otherwise they are always in the house. They don't get the privacy that they need. So women actually get together, and in the name of collecting fuel wood, they go to the forest. So it's not because they need wood, it's also for their own social stimulations. So then what we did was, let's see. So therefore, through this understanding, we realized that we need to have another interaction, that's the water heater. And so when we got the water heater in, we first went and put a couple of water heaters per village, or one heater per village, so that they can touch, feel, understand, and word of mouth. Through that, they understand that it's important. So we didn't want to go and give subsidies straight away and say, just buy this water heater, because we knew it will work. But we allowed those people. So understanding behavior and then allowing them to use it. Then once they know, then the demand came up. And even in COVID, people didn't drop out from the orders that they give. They bought these water heaters. We gave them 75% subsidy. They paid 25%. And even when COVID struck, this is in 2019, but then COVID came, we thought now, because of lack of livelihood, no, not a single family said that we want it free, because it was something that they knew is helpful. And now between the cylinders that the government has given and the water heater, we are now in an area where we can now go and ask, now if people are going into the jungle, what is the reason? And it's not fuel wood at all. So this behavioral aspect of people is the subjective area, and that requires so much more science. And it's not biology now, it is about psychology. And so there is this field that is also now completely new, fresh. But I think going into the future, the scope is also going to go up, because in many things, even in governance in the city, it is about psychology of the people. So that way it's important. One additional thing that I want to say, because it was brought up by our officer friend there, that we need to talk about minimum income or optimum income in these areas. And the biggest impediment to that is money. How much? So if there are 1,500 villages who are sharing their lands with deer, pigs, and tigers, are we going to be able to ask all these villagers to stop farming and that we can pay them money? It's not going to be that easy. We'll need to have more money coming in. And that's where I think, for instance, if Bombay is on the sea, so there is a disaster management plan for the city. And through the disaster management, some amount of money is allocated, because it is a fragile location. Bombay may be hit by cyclones and tsunamis. So therefore, there is an additional money that the government sets aside. Similarly, if you want to protect your the hearts and lungs of a country, that is the protected areas of India, you will have to create something like that, so that the devolution of money, which means from the center to the state, when the money is given, a special amount is set aside, so that it can compensate for the opportunity loss of the people who cannot earn their livelihood, because wildlife lives there, and that wildlife is important for the survival of the forest. So if we can create a mechanism so that money can be channelized in the right way, and that can be done through a criteria which a lot of people have a lot of wisdom now, they can sit and work. And if that can be done, I think, and another, so attached with that is what is called payment for ecosystem services. So today, Tadoba or a Pench or a Corbett or a Nagarole is harvesting water for big cities. Nagpur receives water from Pench. So many different prospering. So for instance, Bangalore receives so much water from different rivers which are originating into the west, from Western Ghats. So if somehow we have a mechanism where a human being who lives in these cities can pay a little bit of amount, which means say 6 paisa a day or just 10 paisa a day, then you will have enough and more money to overcome the problems that the villagers are facing, why should I and you suppress a villager from building a big skyscraper in that village? Because we are using whatever we are using, but we are not paying for, or not even a fraction of what we are using. The water that we are using is just 6 rupees for 10,000 liters. So if the water is underpriced, how am I going to be sitting in Bombay and respecting the river and therefore respecting the forest? So I am always thinking how these beautiful ideas that we all have, and there are good officers, there are a lot of scientists, conservationists, and people who want to do it, but the problem is that we don't find money for it, and the money will come from these kind of things where we talk of payment for ecosystem services so that we give back to those communities who are allowing those forests and wildlife to survive, and we also use what we use for disaster management so that there is more money coming. And once that happens, then whatever Dr. Ramgavkar is saying is possible, where we can then give them minimal wage, and in those villages where there is a problem of crop raiding and all that, we could move slowly from a largely historic kind of a agriculture practices to agroforestry slowly, so that while they move from say bajra or rice or wheat to tree based agriculture, the dip that they will have for the first 5-6 years can be compensated. Once you do that, they will have more time and they will probably have more revenue as well, because it will be a hybrid kind of an agriculture. Sorry for a long answer, but we have to tackle the economics of it if we want to find solutions.
Right. So what I take back from this is that all sectors, behavior change, agriculture, finance, animal husbandry and forest department and so on, everybody needs to come together to solve for any conservation forest related issue. That actually brings me to the last question that we have today for all three of you. In 30 seconds or less, what would you like the lawyers and the listeners to take back from this topic of human-wildlife conflict or interface management from your perspective and from the background that you come from? Let's start with Akhleshwari.
I'm not gonna lie, okay, like working in the wildlife field or for human rights is often fruitless and hard and long, and it has very few wins. But it's important to realize that the people you're trying to defend, the animals that you're trying to protect, they don't have the luxury of despair. You can despair as much as you want, but they have to live their lives. So if you want to help, sort of important to keep the despair away. And honestly, it doesn't have to be massive changes that you make. It doesn't have to be the overhaul of an entire system. But one tweak, one small thing, changing the mind of one IAS officer, that's all you need. Multiple hundreds of thousands of people can be helped that way. So just, be realistic, but expect a little bit of misery. But I mean, if you want to do good, stay on. That's all.
Thank you for that. Dr. Jitendra, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yeah. I would like everybody to understand that the problems that we face, particularly when we have such a large human population and wildlife living together in most part of the country, problems are going to be complex. But I think there is a lot of hope. The kind of solutions that we are putting in place in various areas, some of them are working. Definitely, some of them are not working, because that's why we try numerous solutions. But whatever is working, we need to scale it up. And there is hope to a better coexisting strategies. And whatever is working today is due to a lot of efforts, a lot of science that has gone into it. And in future also, we can find solutions to the most complex problems. And it is a testimony that the kind of wildlife that we see in India, it's a testimony that our efforts are showing some result. And in future also, as science grows and as we try to employ multiple solutions to this problem, we will learn more, and future is bright for, though complicated and tough, but it's going to be a hopeful and a bright future for us.
Thank you for that.
So I think for natural ecosystems and wildlife is the conveyor belt that's providing us all the goods, all the quality of life that we know of and we have experienced. That no matter how it looks, we have to understand that we don't attribute the problem to the wrong individuals. And wildlife, you and I are talking here. This is about people, for people, by people, but we are infinitesimally small in terms of the time that we have spent on this planet compared to the millions of other organisms who predate us, and not predate us, pre-date us. And before we entered, we evolved on this planet, the planet did absolutely well. The planet doesn't need us, we need the planet. And that we have to understand. So we have to be humble. The problem is multifold. It comes from different angles. So we have to understand that the solutions are not going to be simple. So legal, psychological, social, economics, all these things, and science and technology, they have to work together. And we need to finally make sure that we have happy people around the forest. If there are happy people around forests and other ecosystems will survive. So the problems are not just about these villages. The problems are in the cities. The cities have to play the role so that people in the forests are happy. If they are, then we have solved it.
Thank you so much for that. And once again, thanks to all three of you for sharing your thoughts and this wonderful discussion. Thanks to all the audience for patiently listening to this extremely niche topic. I will hand it over to the Moot Court Association to end.
Thank you, Shivangi.
Mr. Jitendra Ramgaonkar, Mr. Anish Andheria, Ms. Akhileshwari Reddy, Ms. Shivangi Adani, participants, ladies and gentlemen, it has truly been a privilege for the Moot Court Association of Government Law College to organize and host this panel discussion in association with the Wildlife Conservation Trust and the Initiative for Climate Action. The panelists, through their enlightening discussion, have managed to highlight the different perspectives of this relevant contemporary issue. We would like to personally thank each and every one of the panelists for taking out their valuable time and providing an enriching educational experience for all the attendees of this panel discussion. Our moderator, Ms. Shivangi Adani, has led this panel discussion with utmost expertise and has managed to encapsulate the very purpose behind the current topic of compensation as a tool to mitigate human-wildlife conflict, a topic which is very relevant for the current times. Mr. Jitendra Ramgaonkar, the Field Director of the Tadoba Andhari Tiger Reserve, has helped us understand a very unique perspective on this current issue through his extensive work as a part of the Forest Department in many different wildlife habitats. The President of the Wildlife Conservation Trust, Dr. Anish Andheria, has graced us with his presence and has shared his invaluable experience in wildlife conservation. His expertise in laws relating to environment and wildlife has given us an enlightening insight on the topic of this panel discussion. Lastly, but not the least, I would like to thank Ms. Akhileshwari Reddy, the Senior Resident Fellow at the Vidhi Karnataka, has helped turn this panel discussion into an educational experience unlike any other. We are extremely grateful to her for her prompt consent and enthusiasm.
We would like to extend our sincere gratitude to Dr. Anish Andheria, Ms. P. Samyukta, Mrs. Anukriti Upadhyay, and Ms. Shrutika Mulai from the Wildlife Conservation Trust, Mr. Jay Warrior, Mr. Abhairaj Naik, Ms. Anjali Joisa, and Ms. Shivangi Adani from the Initiative for Climate Action for their unyielding support and cooperation in the organization of this event. The advisory board of the Moot Court Association, comprising of Mr. Ruben Vakil, Mr. Feroz Patel, and Mr. Shanay Bafna, have been a constant pillar of support and guidance. Their unyielding dedication to the Moot Court Association is irreplaceable, and we would like to express our heartfelt gratitude to them for their immense contribution. Finally, we would like to extend our gratitude to all the teams across the country that are participating in this competition. We truly hope that all the participants have found this to be an enriching experience, and we wish everyone the best of luck for the rounds of the Moot Court competition. We will be ending the YouTube live now. Thank you.